Jeb Hensarling, Republican from Texas 5th District, and Representative Mike Pence, Republican Indiana 6th District. Thanks so much for both of you.
Yeah, good morning.
For being with us. You are here to talk about a spending limit amendment to the U.S. Constitution that you're proposing. Tell us, where did the idea come from?
There's a spending crisis. Every day we come to Washington, we hear the term crisis, but this time we had better believe it. And people shouldn't take our word for it. I mean, listen to what the director of the Congressional Budget Office, Doug Elmendorf, said, if I could give you a couple of quotes. Quote, "In sum, the outlook for the federal budget is bleak. U.S. fiscal policy is on an unsustainable path to an extent it cannot be solved with minor tinkering." Our former Comptroller General, who heads up the General Accountability Office, David Walker, has said that the rising cost of our government entitlement spending is a, quote, fiscal cancer that threatens, quote, catastrophic consequences for our economy. Economist Robert Samuelson has stated that spending could lead to, quote, an economic and political death spiral. We know that recently Moody's said that the American people, that our debt offerings are in peril of losing their AAA rating. And now we have a president of the United States who has submitted a 10-year federal budget that we know gives us the largest deficit in the history of America, $1.6 trillion, doubles the national debt in 5 years, triples it in 10 years from when he was first elected. America is on the road to bankruptcy. And so we believe that if you look at the post-World War II era, spending has averaged 20% of the economy. Spending is due under the current plan to rise to 40% of our economy in the lifetimes of my children, and that's not right, that's not fair. And so myself, Mike Pence, John Campbell of California are introducing an amendment to the Constitution to cap the limit of the federal budget to the growth of the family budget and tie it to the economy before we literally bankrupt the nation and put the next generation on a path to having less freedom, less opportunity, and a lower standard of living.
Congressman Pence, why a constitutional amendment? Why take that route?
Well, I think that's a great question, Libby, because I want to agree very strongly first with Jeb that we're facing a fiscal crisis, and the American people know it. I mean, we know it in our guts. I mean, we brought some of the charts that we've put together here that demonstrate, since World War II, this federal government has managed to get by on about 20 cents on the dollar in this economy, but we are on a pathway and a trajectory that by the middle of this century, we will more than double the percentage of this economy that just the federal government consumes by itself. And that's going to make the American people less free, less prosperous, and less secure. And so we need to know that first and foremost. It isn't, Jeb references the current director of the CBO, the former Comptroller General. I mean, we hear these warnings on the margin, but I think the reason why you've seen hundreds of thousands of people on the National Mall on September the 12th, the reason you've seen tea parties is the American people know we can't borrow and spend and bail our way back to a growing America. We can't continue to pile this mountain range of debt on our children and grandchildren without fundamentally changing the nature of this government. Now, you asked the question, why a constitutional amendment? Well, I'm in my 5th term. Seems longer, but I'm pushing my 10th year on Capitol Hill. I have fought against runaway federal spending under a Democrat Congress and a Democrat administration, and as my record will reflect, and so will Jeb's, we fought against runaway federal spending under Republican control in Congress and a Republican administration. And the one thing I know for sure is that everything we've tried up to this point hasn't worked, and frankly, it won't work. If Senator Bunning's experience in the last 24 hours is any teacher, PAYGO survived, 3 weeks? The very first bill that Democrats brought to the Senate after the president signed an executive order under the pay-as-you-go rules, they waived the pay-as-you-go rules. We saw Graham Rudman go the way of the dodo bird. We've seen pronouncements by Republicans about fiscal discipline when we were in charge, and yet government continues to expand the size and scope of government in our lives. The debt doubled under the last administration. It's scheduled to triple under this administration. And so what we've come to the conclusion of is that there has to be some outside force large enough and powerful enough to advocate for the American people in this process. And we believe that not little bipartisan commissions that have no force of law and authority, but rather the Constitution of the United States of America that will say to the Congress, this far and no farther. Now we carve out in our proposal, if there's a declaration of war, I think we went to 50% of the economy and federal spending to defeat Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. But absent a declaration of war or a 2/3 vote in the Congress, the American people have an opportunity with this amendment to say, you can have 20 cents out of the dollar that I earn, and that's it. And anyone who thinks that's unreasonable, all we're talking about is getting by in the next century with what the federal government's gotten by with for the last 60 years. 20% has been the historic average since World War II. And if memory serves, we were under 20% way back in 2007. So this isn't radical surgery. We're going to have to make some choices. We're going to have to pursue reform seriously. But we really believe, my decade on Capitol Hill, Jeb's about a year behind me, has convinced me that we have to employ that power that is the Constitution of the United States, that charter with the American people, and enact this bill in the Congress, send it to the states, and let the American people say to their Congress, this far and no farther on federal spending.
Congressman Hensarling, what do you make of Senator Bunning's stand over the weekend? He didn't want to move forward on what was a pretty popular bill because he was concerned about paying for it.
What a radical notion inside the Beltway that you should actually pay for something. We are not oblivious to the fact that we, unfortunately, under the policies of this president and of this Democratic Congress, we're still mired in roughly double-digit unemployment. And so many members of Congress clearly want to continue to extend forms of unemployment insurance. But at the same time, one of the things that is hindering job growth today is that there is no path to fiscal sustainability. I mean, one of the reasons, and I talk to small business people all over the 5th District of Texas that I have the honor of representing in Congress, and they have a lot of anxiety and uncertainty about, well, how is all this spending going to be paid for? Is there going to be massive tax increases on my small business? Are we going to have massive inflation to where one day we look longingly and nostalgically upon the Carter era of double-digit interest rates and double-digit inflation? And so that's keeping them from expanding jobs today. You can hear Chairman Ben Bernanke say roughly the same thing. And so I think, and I didn't speak to Senator Bunning about this, but the idea that if you're going to spend over here, that you ought to save over there is not foreign to any family or small business in America. It is simply a foreign concept inside the Beltway. And if we would do what Senator Bunning suggested, we would hasten the day where jobs are actually created in this economy.
Is that a tough message back home when we're talking about unemployment benefits, money for doctors to get reimbursements for Medicare, highway money? Those are all things that a lot of people back home may be in favor of.
Well, again, the idea is, though, that you don't take money away from our children and grandchildren to do something that necessarily benefits us today. I mean, for decades and decades, the American ethic has been work hard today so your children can have a better tomorrow. And Washington is turning that on its head. It's saying, let Washington have it easy today so our children have to work harder tomorrow. That's not the vision of the Founding Fathers. It's not the America that we grew up in. It's not the America we're trying to leave to our children and grandchildren.
The two of you have an op-ed piece in the Wall Street Journal today called Time for a Spending Cap with Teeth, and in it you outline your proposal. And you write that, as with other constitutional amendments, Congress would be given the authority to enforce and implement it, but for the first time, the federal government would have a limit on its size and scope. Why is now the time to do this? People have talked about how the economy is very fragile right now. There are still many people who believe that stimulus should be continued and more money should be injected in the economy, and later we should work on deficit reduction. Why now?
Well, I really do believe that the American people know that the strength of this nation is not derived from the size of our treasury or the size of our federal budget. The strength of this nation is found in the ingenuity, the resources, the creativity, the courage, and the sacrifice of the American people. Our founders knew that. The Constitution of the United States is a document of limited government. But we are on a pathway to essentially transform the size and scope of government by the midway through this next century so that it will be indistinguishable from the socialist governments of Europe in its magnitude and size. And I don't think the American people have any confusion about what that means. It means that people in this country understand that as government expands, freedom contracts. And so if we're going to double the size of the federal government as a percentage of our economy, we are going to be less free. I think most Americans know that. In our enterprises, in our personal lives, we know we're going to be less prosperous. There are statistics in the piece that we'll post online, the longer version, about, for every percentage increase in the federal government's expenditure as a portion of GDP, you actually see unemployment go up by a fraction of a percent. This means as government grows, it takes away opportunities for Americans. And the other piece of this is, look, the Bible says that the borrower becomes the slave of the lender. Right now, I think we currently have borrowed about $800 billion from communist China. They are our lead lender right now. The president went there recently to go visit our money. And the American people understand that the communist Chinese have a system that is antithetical to most of the ideals of this free society. And they also have interest in the long term, which could be different than our interests, particularly in the Asian Pacific Rim in the 21st century. And that therefore we erode our security to the extent that we allow our government to expand beyond reasonable and historical boundaries, because we find ourselves having to borrow from those who have antithetical ideals and antithetical strategic interests to the United States of America. So I think the American people know that it is imperative that we put this Congress under either political party and this administration on a pathway toward maintaining the role and the size and the scope the federal government has played historically in our society, or we're going to be less free, less prosperous, and less secure in the 21st century.
Our guests are Congressman Mike Pence, a Republican Conference Chairman, and Representative Jeb Hensarling.
It's a mouthful.
It's a great name. Republican from Texas, member of the Financial Services Committee. Let's go to our calls. We have people lining up to talk to both of you. Edward, Democrats line, Columbus, Ohio. Good morning.
Good morning. I'd like to ask why the two of you are proposing a constitutional amendment right now instead of simply drawing up a list and going public with it as to which cuts you would make in the federal budget to bring it back into balance. It strikes me that what you're doing is more of a stunt or a gimmick rather than actually trying to bring about doing something that would have a more immediate effect. And also it strikes me as cowardly because everybody knows it's easy politically to stand up and say we must have a balanced budget, and I'm sure proposing a constitutional amendment would be popular among Republican voters. But it's a lot riskier politically to say, well, here is how I suggest we should actually redraw the budget to bring it back into balance. And I have one more. Here are the cuts that I would propose, because making cuts are often unpopular. And I have one more question. Did either of you support, and I doubt that both of you did either of you support President Obama's excellent proposal a short while ago for Congress to cooperate with him in creating a commission that would examine and propose how to reduce the national debt? And
let's go with that.
Well, first, there were about 6 or 7 questions there. I'm not sure I can remember each and every one of them. But number one, please go to my website. You can go to Mike Pence's website. I've actually introduced budgets into Congress that would balance the budget. Under the leadership of Mike Pence, when he was chairman of the Conservative Caucus, known as the Republican Study Committee, we put forth a project called Operation Offset, which was a menu of, I believe, $700 billion worth of spending that we believe could have been reduced, reformed, devolved back to the states. I am presently an original co-sponsor of Paul Ryan's roadmap for America that would make our entitlement programs solvent and spare us from bankrupting future generations. So that record is clear, but what I've tried to do is several things. Number one, I've authored something called the Spending, Debt, Deficit, and Control Act, along with Paul Ryan, who's the ranking Republican on the Budget Committee, that totally reforms the budget process to put caps on spending that give the budget the force of law, to create a rainy day fund, sunset commission, a number of good ideas that would limit spending. But that would be statutory. As far as an actual plan, so I try to reform the process, number one. Number two, I sign on to a plan to get us where we need to go. And then third of all, along with Mike Pence, this is to force Congress. If you don't like, for example, the Ryan plan or the Hensarling plan, at least this forces Congress to do something. That's the purpose of the constitutional amendment. And as the father of an 8-year-old and a 6-year-old, I feel a moral obligation to my children not to leave them a sea of red ink. And with respect to President Obama's commission, number one, it's hard to call it a bipartisan commission when 2/3 of the appointees are either Democrats or appointed by the president. Second of all, I believe it has about a 5-year charge when we have a generational problem. And we don't need a deficit commission, we need a spending commission. The deficit is the symptom. It is spending that is the disease. Spending is due to double, and when it doubles, there will be a lower standard of living. Again, don't take my word for it. Check out the charts of the Congressional Budget Office, the Office of Management and Budget, any economist, and just plain common sense. We're on the verge of being the first generation in America's history to leave the next generation a lower standard of living, less freedom, and fewer opportunities. We will break faith with the founding fathers and earlier generations that have sacrificed so much. So that's why we need a constitutional amendment to ensure that we don't have this dire future and that we keep faith with our founding fathers.
Could there be a starting point with this commission? Is there room to get involved and craft it in a way that might be more something that you are more in favor of?
Well, I never want to say never. And if the president invites you, you'd give it serious consideration. But again, it's hard to take it seriously, number one, when, as I understand it, they've taken one of the major entitlement programs off the table for any reforms. Number two, 2/3 of the appointees are either appointed by the president or Democrats. It's hard to get bipartisan support for a package like that. And then number three, all it is doing is saying, well, let's tinker around the problem for the next 5 years. And oh, by the way, let's not report until after the election so that maybe I can get this issue off the table going into the midterm elections. I mean, it almost seems like a desperate cry from the president, please stop me before I spend again. But, you know, could something good come out of it? Again, I never want to say never, but given the ground rules and the way it's laid down, I think I would have very, very low expectations for this commission.
Let's go to New York City where Guillermo is on the independent caller line. Good morning.
Good morning. How are you doing this morning?
Good. Go right ahead.
Listen, I just got a question. My question basically is about the spending issue. The whole thing is that I keep on thinking to myself and everything like that. I mean, you know, and it is right. You know, the spending does have to stop. But where was both of you guys' voice way back when the Bush era was actually spending all this massive amount of money, and really got us all into a debt situation that you know, I mean, literally, you know, I'm not no economist or anything like that, but you know, I mean, you know, I'm pretty, you know. I'm pretty sure that, you know, basically I do know the concept of, you know, saying to actually make money, you have to spend a little money. And, you know, saying we're spending a lot of money, but hopefully it would actually make us money in the future.
Let's get a response.
Well, I love these softball pitches. I mean, the last caller asking Jeb Hensarling if he's ever embraced a balanced budget or offered one. Yes, we have. All right, we part of our call for a constitutional amendment is that we have been offering these proposals, and they've been falling on deaf ears here in Washington, D.C. among a political class in both political parties that has this government on a trajectory to double the size, the amount that it consumes of this economy by the middle part of this century, and the American people know it. Now, with regard to where were you guys, you know, I'd say in all humility, check the record. Some people describe both Jeb Hensarling and myself as a thorn in the flesh of the Bush administration, and also a Republican majority. We fought against the leaders of our party on Capitol Hill and in the Bush administration on the Medicare prescription drug entitlement, on No Child Left Behind. I was in fighting for fundamental reforms, for earmark reforms. And what we're trying to say from our heart here, with offering this bold new idea, is that the truth is that as they're saying on all the cable TV networks, government is broken. I have become convinced that neither political party left to its own devices will ever reverse the trajectory that the government is on today, absent the direct engagement of the American people. I mean, Alexander Hamilton said famously during the period of the American founding, referring to Congress, he told some Frenchman that, "Here, sir, the people govern." But the truth is that there is a political class in Washington, D.C. that seems intent on dealing with these frightening numbers by simply raising taxes. The majority leader of the House of Representatives gave a thoughtful speech this week talking about the fiscal crisis that we're facing as a nation was a test of our moral character, and then he advocated raising taxes. Well, you know, a character test generally in my life has involved whether I'm willing to make sacrifices, whether I'm willing to make hard choices, to live up to my word, to keep my priorities where they belong. But Washington, D.C., it's always more government, it's always more taxes, and to some extent, as we found fighting against the leadership of our own party, a president of our own party, that we need to call on the American people and call on their charter, which is the Constitution of the United States of America, and say this far and no farther. And so this very much, Libby, to your point, to the caller's point, we've been in these fights. And we've seen the futility of them.
We have a related question on Twitter.
And we think we need to do something fundamentally different, and that's where the constitutional amendment idea comes from.
Congressman Hensarling, Marion writes, "Don't forget the president is paying for past wars and past deficit and paying for tax cuts for the rich that were never paid." So another one of our viewers also reflecting back on what happened during the Bush years.
Well, number one, if you look at the record, and as Mike is so eloquently said, a number of us were fighting what we considered to be excess spending under Republican control. But if you look at the record, in the 12 years that Republicans were in the majority of Congress, and you look at the average annual deficit, then you compare it to the 3 years that Democrats have been in control of Congress. I mean, what you discover is what used to be our annual deficits have essentially become their monthly deficits. So on an order of magnitude, did we spend too much money? Yes, but we are rank amateurs compared to them. With respect to tax relief, you can look that after the President Bush signed into law tax relief aimed at struggling families, small businesses, investors, guess what? Tax revenues increased every single year. Again, don't take my word for it, check the record. And by the way, it is the people's money. And if I could harken back to, I guess, the previous caller, where we have to spend the money to make the money, right now it looks like we have to spend money to lose money. I mean, the president's talking about yet again another stimulus plan with interest. The previous one cost us $1.2 trillion, and what has it gotten us? You know, another 3.5 million of our fellow countrymen have since lost their jobs, with one exception. Unemployment, more people have lost their jobs each and every month. Unemployment stays mired at roughly double digits, a generational high. Again, what we need here is we need a pathway to fiscal sanity, and that will help create jobs here and now. And so that's why it's so critical that we put forth this plan.
Let's go to Drew on a Republicans line in New York City. Good morning, Drew.
Good morning. How you guys doing this morning?
Good, Drew.
Good. How are you?
I commend you guys, and I'm happy that you guys are trying to do this and make a constitutional amendment. I don't think people understand that the amount of money owed back to these banks because of government borrowing, which consists of principal and interest, will always exceed the amount of money that's available in circulation. That's why inflation is a constant, because new money is always needed to cover this perpetual deficit. And I'm going to give a quote from Thomas Jefferson. He said, "I believe that banking institutions are more dangerous than standing armies. If the American people ever allow private banks to control the issue of currency, the banks and corporations that will grow up around them will deprive people of their property until their children wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered." So people don't understand this spending. They want to make excuses and say it's necessary. But when do you stop? Do you stop when we're slaves to this debt and the American people have no opportunity for growth at all? And Obama has the Trilateral Commission who helped us get into this mess.
Well, Drew, thanks for the call. My sense of this is that the American people know in their guts that we're on a pathway toward fiscal catastrophe, but we don't yet have it on the table where we have created an environment where the Congress and the administration are prepared to deal with it. And Drew's comments notwithstanding about debt, let me say we need look no further than the headlines today about the situation in Greece. I think, Jeb, according to our estimates, in about 20 years on the current trajectory, these projections don't even include Obamacare. They don't even include future stimulus bills. They don't include more expansions in the size and scope of government that's contemplated by liberals in Washington, D.C. At the current rate of projected growth with existing programs, in 20 years, our debt will exceed 130% of GDP, according to estimates. That's roughly where Greece is today, and Greece is in a fiscal crisis. They cannot borrow money. The other powers in the EU will not loan them money because there's no confidence that Greece will be able to meet their obligations, even in making interest payments. And in a very real sense, the American people deserve to know we are on a trajectory to have a national debt in the size and magnitude relative to our economy of Greece's national debt in just 20 years. But what I hope is despite the gloom and doom of some of these projections, is if the American people will simply say to their national government, we just want you to live within the means you've lived within since World War II. We've given you 20 cents on the dollar. You all just keep figuring that out. Tell us some responsible and compassionate ways that you can reform current public systems so that we'll meet obligations. But you all, absent a declaration of war or a 2/3 vote in the Congress, some national emergency, we want you to live with what you've been living with. I think we've got time to do this. And frankly, while we allow Libya a time frame, I think we have 10 years where this could be adopted by the states and then 5 years of implementation. The truth is, while the balanced budget amendment to the Constitution was never adopted, most historians recognize that the discussion of a balanced budget amendment in the 1980s set the table for balanced budgets in the 1990s. The old book says, without a vision, the people perish. What we're hoping to catalyze here is not just an esoteric discussion about amending the Constitution, but what is the proper size and scope of government to initiate, as Jeb and I say in the Wall Street Journal today, to initiate a national debate over what's the proper size of government, because we know that debate itself and the whole discussion of an amendment of this nature in state legislatures and in the Congress will drive public policy on Capitol Hill, because the truth is the message about spending is getting through. We've just got to add some meaning to it, some boundaries to it, and we think saying 1/5 of the American economy, which is the historic average of the last 60 years, will have an immediate impact on policy decisions in Washington as this moves forward.
Congressman Pence, you mentioned the situation in Greece. This from the Financial Times. Greece will today announce a new austerity package of tax rises and spending cuts worth up to 4.8 billion euros. Government officials said the move follows falls yesterday, and the cost of funding Greek debt to its lowest levels in weeks as hopes were pinned on the measures for reducing the budget deficit. So that country facing some pretty severe financial situations there.
And facing some very severe cuts. I mean, I haven't read the stories yet today of what they're proposing, but I can't imagine they're going to get anybody to lend them money unless they actually cut a number of their entitlement programs. We can get where we need to go by reducing the rate of growth in entitlements. If we don't, Medicare goes bankrupt in about 10 years, Social Security goes bankrupt by 2038, and that absent the effort of the American people through their Constitution to relimit the spending of this government, our children and grandchildren are going to be facing exactly the kind of decisions that Greece is facing today.
And Mike is making an excellent point, and that is that the cost of delay is simply incredible. The type of austerity program, as the newspaper alluded to in Greece, I'm sure is going to be quite painful to that society. We still have an opportunity if we act today. That again, you don't have to cut, you have to restrain the growth. If the family budget is growing at 2% a year, you can't have government grow at 5 and 6% a year. It's quite simply live within your means. But I believe I have this number right. Even under the president's budget today, by the end of the 10-year budget that he has proposed, we're going to be paying something like $800 billion in interest alone. I mean, that's roughly $7,000 per American family. That's why it's so critical that we act today, and nothing will force Congress to act quite like a constitutional amendment, and the time to act is now.
Let's get some more callers in here. We've only got about 10 more minutes with you guys. Want to hear from Tony, Democrats line in St. Louis, Missouri.
Yes, good morning.
Hi, Tony, welcome.
Listen, I understand that you keep talking about the size of government. You know, oh, it's too big. Well, you know, I don't want to ask too many questions because I understand that 6 questions is too many to handle. But one question, how big does government need to be? Let's say, for instance, we have 15, 20 million people in government right now. People are complaining about our meats. You know, we have salmonella through everything, even in spinach and everything. But we need more workers there. We need more workers in the mobile department when you're getting your license and stuff like that. But they can't be filled. Specifically, easy question, how big should government be?
Well, first, I know I somehow end up with all the Democratic questions, but Tony, here's the answer. 20% is what we're saying. In the post-World War II era of our history, the federal government has taken 20%. But again, as the economy grows, so grows the government. But today we have this very perverse result that, as far as I know, the only sector of the economy that is growing is government. And so, you know, the president talks about these jobs that have been created or saved. Well, most of those are government jobs. The federal payrolls have increased, and ultimately the money has to come from somewhere. And many of us believe that money is coming from the small businesses, for example, in Athens, Texas, and Maybank, Texas, that I have the honor and privilege of supporting, representing in the United States House of Representatives. But we right now are on a pathway to double the size of government. Now, maybe for yourself or maybe for others who are Democrats, that doesn't bother you. Well, it bothers me, because ultimately I believe at 40%, taking 40 cents out of every dollar, taking that much bread off the table of the American people, fundamentally changes the role of government in a free society. I do not believe it is commensurate with the vision of the Founding Fathers, number one. Number two, I think that leads to a future where my children and my grandchildren are going to live in smaller houses. They're going to drive older cars. They're going to have fewer jobs. They're going to have shrinking paychecks, and they're going to live in an America where the American dream is confined to a small little space. That is not keeping faith with our forefathers. That is not discharging our duties and our moral obligations to future generations. I think that does put us on the road to be Greece, to be France without the wine and the art. That's not the vision I have for the greatest nation in the history of mankind.
Let's get our next caller, independent line, Stephen from Louisiana. Good morning, Stephen.
Morning, folks.
Good morning.
I got something I need to ask. Why is it only 49% of the population's paying taxes? Why doesn't everybody pay a flat 10% tax? No exemptions. Nobody is exempt, including churches, businesses, and individuals. Why is that so complicated?
Well, I notice once again my friend Mike Pence gets all the easy questions.
Well, I'm happy to talk about tax policy on the next edition of Morning Edition. I've been for a flat tax, and I'm for a national sales tax to replace the income tax. And I think tax policy is all related to growth. People that want to solve this debt picture by raising taxes are precisely the same people that think that you can raise taxes without harming the economy. And I think the opposite is true. I think what you tax, you get less of. What you subsidize, you get more of. Right now, we're subsidizing more government, and we're taxing economic growth and prosperity in this country, and people know it. But if I can go back to Tony's previous question, how big does government need to be? I think despite the dripping contempt in his question, I think Tony asked the exact right question. What we're saying is, let's have that debate. How big does government need to be? Well, since World War II, we have created the freest and most prosperous and most powerful nation in the history of mankind, with the federal government getting 20 cents on the dollar out of my paycheck. Now, we are on track by the middle of this century to be taking 40% on the dollar out of my paycheck, and on a trajectory where I truly believe most Americans know we will be less free, less prosperous, and less secure. So for twice the amount of money, you're going to have less freedom, you're going to have less economic opportunity, and frankly, we're going to have less ability to provide for the common defense. So let's have that debate. And I just want to really affirm Tony, who's out there, to say that's precisely why Jeb Hensarling and I are introducing this constitutional amendment. We think history's a teacher. We think the size and scope of government, limited government, has had a great deal to do with us becoming the freest and most prosperous and most powerful nation in the history of the world. And we believe that's worth debating and worth fighting for, but let the debate begin.
We have another Louisiana caller, Donna, and this one's for you, Congressman, on the Republicans line. Go ahead, Donna.
Oh, good morning. What an honor. Thank you both for digging in your heels for us. I want to make a comment on the amendment.
Sure.
And just thank you for bringing this up. And what penalties, though, would be possible for, they run over the Constitution like they're running red lights and don't think anything about it. So how can they be held accountable?
Well, ultimately, the way that people are held accountable in Congress is the voters have an opportunity to renew our contracts every 2 years. But you bring up an excellent point, Donna, and that is how will this be enforced? You look at the other 27 amendments to the Constitution, and ultimately, we do have a Supreme Court that interprets that Constitution, makes rulings, and then ultimately it's we the people who have to decide, is Congress abiding by both the spirit and the letter of the law, is ultimately determined by a Supreme Court that may be a most imperfect Supreme Court. Congress has tried everything they could to avoid any type of spending discipline in Washington. There's nothing easier to do than to take money away from future generations and to essentially pay current political constituencies. That's putting us on the road to bankruptcy today. That is putting us on the road to ensuring our children and grandchildren have a lower standard of living, less freedom, fewer opportunities. That is why Mike and I and John Campbell of California have introduced what we believe is really the ultimate tool, and that is a constitutional amendment. And low be it to members of Congress at that point to try to avoid and evade the sacred foundation of our republic, and that is the Constitution.
Yeah. Let's go to Reggie, independent caller, right here in Washington, D.C. Good morning.
Yeah, good morning, guys. I definitely appreciate the hard work that everyone's trying to do in Congress, and just listening. You guys are great politicians. I'll give you credit, but politics has to end right about now because it's an emergency here. We all know that a constitutional amendment is not going to pass. It's not going to happen. Why don't we focus on something that can really get done? we need something that can really be done, not politics. Because like everyone's saying, we see the future and it's not looking great. Yeah, I don't think we're going to wind up like Greece, but come on. I mean, let's get something done that can really pass, not not politics.
Reggie, Reggie, what would you like to see? Do you have any suggestions for the congressman?
Well, I think we're at a good start. Pay as you go is great. To start paying for what is out there, and somebody mentioned a flat tax earlier. I think a flat tax is fair. Because you got a lot of people that don't pay anything. If you raise the tax limit, let's say 15-20% across the board on sales, no more payroll tax. That means everybody that spends has to pay. You have people now that don't pay anything. They don't pay any tax at all, and it's not fair.
Well, I think I love the spirit and temperament in Reggie's comments. But I think you're selling the American people a little short on this one, Reg. I really am. I mean, I'm used to political elites here in Washington, D.C. welcome ideas that limit the power of Washington and expand the power of the American people the same way that pigeons welcome new statues in this city. But I think you sound like my kind of guy. I believe in the American people. I don't believe in this city. I've been here 10 years, and two things have happened. During that 10 years period of time, my opinion of the American people has gone up, and my opinion of their national government has gone down. And as we said before, we've both fought runaway federal spending under Democrats in the Congress and the White House, but we were also fighting runaway federal spending under Republicans in Congress and the White House. And the truth is, I think you give the American people something straightforward, an honest debate about the size and scope of government. And what we're saying here, and there will be people, I think we've already been maligned on the internet. You can find us called all kinds of names already this morning, and that's great. But the point here is, I think you give the American people a reasonable range for the size of government based upon what we've spent on government as a percentage of our economy since World War II, and you say to them, up or down, would you like Congress in the next 50 years to live within the same means that it lived with in the last 50 years, or do you want it to double? Double in its role in your life, double the amount of spending, and do you think that would make us less free, less prosperous, and less secure? I think you give the American people this choice, and I think not only do I believe that the American people got behind a spending limit amendment, that we could build some fence lines around runaway federal spending in the long term in the Constitution. We've put economic policy in the Constitution before, the income taxes in the Constitution. We have the Interstate Commerce Clause. Some historians believe the Constitution actually was an economic document. But I believe you put those fence lines in there, and not only could this take effect and be enforced, as Jeb said, but I also believe that this whole debate will get this town to straighten up and fly right and go, well, it looks like the American people actually would like us to continue to live at about the level within the means we've lived the last 60 years, so maybe we should start doing that.
Well, if I could add to that, I think one of the things Reggie was saying is, I'm concerned about this, but I just don't see any opportunity here. They probably said the same thing decades ago about giving Libby and every other woman in America the right to vote, that this is a constitutional amendment that could never pass. Well, guess what? One day it did pass. Right. And all I can say is, I don't know what the chances are of actually getting this passed, but I do know this. Never in my lifetime has there been a greater opportunity, more angst, more anxiety, more gut reaction from the American people that something is amiss, that the government must live within its means. And the last thing I would say on behalf of myself and Mike and John Campbell, who isn't here today, how do you not do this if you know what's happening? Right. We've actually seen the numbers. We've read the reports. We've looked at history. We know where this is headed. And it's either headed towards a massive tax increase on the American people, it's headed towards incredible inflation, it's headed to more debt where we go on bended knee to Japan and China and beg them to buy our debt. And ultimately, again, it leads to a less free, less prosperous, lower standard of living for our children. And so we feel, frankly, an obligation to put this out there. And as one of the earlier callers who said, well, what is the size of government? What should it be? That's exactly the debate we want to have. And we believe that ultimately there should be, this is the whole debate, is should there be a limit on the size and scope of the federal government. Should that be enshrined in the Constitution? And if it isn't, what are we going to do to keep this nation from bankruptcy and ensure that we keep the America that we know?
Congressman Jeb Hensarling of Texas and Congressman Mike Pence of Indiana, thanks so much to both of you for being with us.
Thanks, Libby.
Their op-ed piece, Time for a Spending Cap with Teeth, is in today's Wall Street Journal, and it lays out their proposal for a constitutional amendment to cap spending. Thanks. Coming up next, Congressman